when fighting is going on, it makes it that much more complicated, challenging, and most importantly, dangerous for those delivering the aid and receiving the aid.
Now, to get you more details on what the collapse of the truce may mean, we are being joined by Edward P. Joseph, who's a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University and a foreign policy analyst. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the broadcast, Mr. Joseph.
Good to be with you.
I'll begin with the renewed fighting in Gaza that has stretched into a second day on Saturday, and after talks extended, a week-old truce with Hamas collapsed. And what happens next?
Well, we see that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is doing his best to try to ensure that the situation does not revert to what we saw before. He did two things that was very important today in Israel. Number one, he made it very clear, as your introductory package showed, that Hamas is to blame singularly for the breakdown of the humanitarian pause. And he noted the terrorist attack in Jerusalem that killed 3 Israelis and stated that Hamas already had not fulfilled the agreed terms for the humanitarian pause, in addition to firing rockets before the pause had even ended. So he made that very clear. At the same time, he also made it clear to the Israelis that they have to do much better in terms of sustaining their operations, which the United States still backs. There's not any difference about that. The U.S. supports the intent to destroy Hamas and get rid of this virulent actor in Gaza. But according to Antony Blinken, he states, I made it clear that the amount of civilian casualties we had in the north can't repeat itself in the south. That is when Israel turns its attention, the military operation, to the south. And from the Israeli side, the indicators are that they understand that. And a senior military official in Israel indicated that the operation would be relying more on ground operations than it would on air, and that this would reduce civilian casualties. Please.
And Mr. Joseph, Qatar now says that it will persist in seeking a renewed agreement, but warned that the resumption of hostilities is complicating matters. Now, what do you think this renewed agreement would look like, if at all it comes into the picture?
It's hard to understand what the Qataris exactly have in mind. What they presumably want to do is to try to resurrect the terms that led to the initial hostage release, but that's very difficult here because, again, as Secretary of State Blinken made it unequivocally clear, it was Hamas that broke the terms. So from the Israeli side, there's already very clear that there's a breakdown here and a clear demonstration of what Hamas's intentions are. And the wider point here, Aditi, that I think people don't understand is the unity within Israel to, at this time, even despite serious concerns and even opposition to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And much of this, of course, stretches back to October 7th, which, of course, has been lost in the minds of so many protesters around the world who are, of course, understandably concerned about the death toll on Palestinians, including women and, above all, children. So that's what's been lost here. And what I would do, Aditi, as we don't have time, is simply turn your viewers' attention to the Twitter profile of a former U.S. Army officer, Alex Plitzas, who witnessed the video. This is a battle-hardened expert who has witnessed ISIS videos, Alex Plitzas, P-L-I-T-S-A-S, who saw yesterday the Hamas's own videos of what it did on October 7th. And Alex Plitzas, states that I can tell you unequivocally, having seen ISIS videos, that what I saw by Hamas was worse than the ISIS videos I've had to review in the course of my duties. And he goes on, Alex Plitzas, P-L-I-T-S-A-S, to say one of the more chilling and vile aspects of this Hamas attack that differs from videos I've seen of both al-Qaeda and ISIS atrocities is the maniacal laughter and the joy that the terrorists expressed while torturing and murdering unarmed civilians to include women and small children. So see, this is what has been lost here in of course, the discussion of the understandable, of the terrible death toll on Palestinian civilians, is that Hamas is not interested in liberation. It is interested in annihilation. And the United States understands that. Arab neighbors of Israel understand that. But it is the challenge for Israel to continue this military operation while minimizing the terrible toll that has been inflicted on Palestinian civilians, above all children. Please.
Mr. Joseph, speaking of challenges and complications, I would like to shift your attention now to the reports that have come in that Yemen's Houthi rebels had threatened to escalate their attacks while the ceasefire was on against Israel if ceasefire ends. And now there have been a lot of talks and incidents that point towards the war possibly turning into a multi-front war for Israel, and also the latest fighting on the Israel-Lebanon border that has resumed. Now, do you think the spillover is in the vicinity?
I think it's always a possibility. We know that. For the moment, we see that Hezbollah, which is the primary actor, not the Houthis in Yemen, they are already did a demonstration act by seizing a British vessel in the Red Sea. So they already demonstrated their intent to try to be part of the overall operation. But it is really Hezbollah that is the main actor. That's the party that has serious missilery, completely backed by Iran, which has projects its destabilizing influence in the Middle East through proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. And so far, Hezbollah has backed off. Its leader, Nasrallah, has said that, indicated when he gave a big address, that they would not take this opportunity now to join in on behalf of Hamas. So they backed off, and the reason they backed off, Aditi, is because they're afraid that they will be pulverized by Israeli military if they get into an engagement and earnest conflict, direct conflict with Israel. And that will put them at disadvantage in Lebanon, where, of course, they are despised by other factions within Lebanon. So that's, for the moment, Iran and its proxy Hezbollah have been cautious about getting into a frontal conflict with Israel. Please.
Mr. Joseph, thank you for joining us and giving us all those insights. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Now, the truce between Israel and Hamas has come to an end early this morning. And today happens to be day 56 of this grueling, bruising war in which over 15,000 innocent Palestinian civilians have been bombed to their deaths. And what has happened since this morning, ever since Israel resumed its campaign of relentless bombing again, is that 109 Palestinians have been killed. Many are said to be women and children. After 7 days of a tenuous peace, hospitals in Gaza are again witnessing the same vulnerable condition. There are waves of wounded who are being brought into the hospitals, desperate for treatment, desperate to save those who are grievously wounded.
Medical teams could not bear the big number of patients that arrived to the hospitals of Gaza Strip as a result of pile-up of previous cases in the hospitals. Their departure to outside Gaza Strip is very slow. There are still hundreds of cases in the departments of all hospitals in Gaza Strip.
So as the war resumes, the question, of course, remains, have the mediators failed in extending the truce? And if they have failed, is Israel's intention to expand its ground offensive? As for the latest, the Israeli airstrikes have been reported across the enclave, including in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, which, remember, should have been a safe zone. The Israeli military has announced that it is dividing the entirety of the Gaza Strip into dozens of numbered blocks, and it has dropped leaflets onto Gaza with a QR code to a website with a map of all the areas and geolocating people within them. Israel knows the address and phone number of every resident in the Gaza Strip. Now, the innocent civilians are asking, after having gotten assurances and after having been repeatedly told to head to the south of Gaza, which was declared by the Israelis as a safe zone, why is the Israeli military now attacking them in a place that Israel had said was a safe zone?
We left from Al-Qara village to Khan Yunis, and all of a sudden, after the temporary truce, the Israelis came up with new orders telling us that people from Al-Qara, Habatan and Al-Fuza had to leave to Rafah. I mean from day one, from one place to other and another, from the north to the south, from the center, who knows where next. And there is no electricity, no water, no food, no good living conditions, and we are patient. And we are patient.
So even though the renewed offensive appears to be wide-ranging, what happens to the remaining hostages? What happens to those military personnel who had been abducted? Now, since the truce was announced, an extended Hamas member has freed at least about 110 captives, including 80 Israelis. In exchange, Israel has released about 240 Palestinian prisoners, including women and predominantly children, many of whom have been in Israeli prison for months without even charges being leveled against them. The prospect of Israel expanding its ground campaign southward has also heightened international anxiety, including in the White House, which has warned its close ally to moderate its military tactics to reduce civilian casualties and the depopulation that is being witnessed in the Gaza Strip.
In my meetings today with the Prime Minister and senior Israeli officials, I made clear that before Israel resumes major military operations, it must put in place humanitarian civilian protection plans that minimize further casualties of innocent Palestinians.
So with most Israelis supportive of a war that they see as essential to their own security, Netanyahu has always said that the war will restart with full force after negotiations had run their course. The ceasefire, after a week in which diplomacy was given a bit of priority, violence in the Gaza Strip is once again the dominant part of what is unfolding in the Gaza Strip, where the campaign of relentless bombing has again begun.
The sound of bombardments and ambulances are back in Gaza after a halt of more than 6 days. Israel launched several strikes in southern Gaza, where over 100 people were killed within the first few hours of the fighting. Hospitals in Khan Yunis are overwhelmed with wounded people. Khan Yunis came under intensive bombardment as the deadline lapsed. And according to the medics, the bombing was most intense in Khan Yunis and Rafah. Hundreds of thousands of people are sheltering in these parts, and after Israel ordered them to evacuate North Gaza, many Gazans are saying trapped and confused. And the
ceasefire, which had lasted for 7 days, hung by a thread, and it snapped yesterday morning. And immediately afterwards, Israel began its campaign of relentless bombings, and just in the last 24 hours, at least about 178 people have been killed, and scores of others have been very grievously injured. Now, this moment, it is difficult to predict as to where this war is headed. Now, the United States, as it has always done, has backed the Israeli side, and it has said that Hamas is responsible for ending the ceasefire. Now, the Americans have blamed Hamas for the failure to produce a list of hostages that would have helped a further extension in the truce. Hamas, on the other hand, has accused Israel and the United States of having walked out of this ceasefire and of having resorted to this campaign of relentless bombings that has worsened the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip.
يعني احنا نرجع الفشل للطرفين الإسرائيلي والأمريكي. الطرف الإسرائيلي يوم أمس بالليل كان واضح أنه هو يريد العودة إلى القتال. جرى طرح أكثر من فكرة من قبل الوسطاء. نحن تجاوبنا مع 3 أفكار منها، ورغم ذلك الإسرائيلي كان يقول لا 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 في كل مرة.
Now, Israel is vowed to carry on with achieving its goals in the Gaza Strip, but how it wants to do it is still not clear, because the only strategy that Israel has been using is to drop bombs on the Gaza Strip, resulting in worsening the humanitarian catastrophe and suffering of the Palestinian people. And also, the country's defense minister Yoav Gallant has told his Air Force fighter pilots that Hamas only understands force, and Israel will continue to bomb the Gaza Strip.
כפי שאמרתי מהיום הראשון, אני חוזר ואומר עכשיו, ארגון החמאס מבין רק כוח. אנחנו נמשיך ונקה אותו עד שנשיג את מטרות המלחמה, פירוק ארגון החמאס, שלילת יכולותיו הצבאיות והחזרתם של החטופים אל ביתם.
Israel has released a video showing its resumed operations in the Gaza Strip. It says that it has struck operational command centers in the enclave and also underground sites and a military compound since the truce ended. Now, Israel also claims to have eliminated certain Hamas strongholds within the Gaza Strip. But remember, what is happening at this moment is that Israel is carrying out bombings in some of the most densely populated areas in the Gaza Strip. There's no place that is safe in Gaza, and especially southern Gaza, where Israel had been exhorting all Palestinians to flee to for safety, has now come in the crosswires of the Israelis. The large parts of Khan Yunis city have been bombed with a campaign of intense bombardment that Israel has resorted to since yesterday morning. The scores of people have been killed in Khan Yunis. Many of them were rushed to the hospitals as they were injured very grievously in the strikes. They had to be pulled out virtually by hand from underneath the rubble. Now, Hamas has also released videos to show the launch of a few of its rudimentary drones that it has towards the Israeli army tanks in the Gaza Strip. Silent explosions were heard in Israel as some of these crude rockets that Hamas has got were fired from the Gaza Strip. Now, fighting has also resumed on the Israel-Lebanon border as well. The Israeli army has released a video to show the Israelis carrying out air bombings on certain targets that they claim were Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. According to the Lebanese state media, the Israeli shelling has resulted in deaths of 3 civilians in southern Lebanon immediately after the truce ended. Now, Israel has confirmed that 6 of the Hamas hostages are now dead. This is something that the Israelis have now come forward and said. Now, the army has not yet verified the death of the youngest hostage taken by Hamas, who was a 10-month-old baby, and also his family. Now, remember, Hamas had said that these Israeli hostages had been hidden in one of its tunnels, and they died because Israelis bombed that tunnel. Now, talking about the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, the White House says that it believes that Israel will allow for humanitarian aid trucks to enter into Gaza, but the number of deliveries will be reduced significantly. The United Nations, meanwhile, has said that the humanitarian aid delivery to Gaza is an unknown after the restart of the fighting.
It's kind of a unknown. Even before this pause, we were able to get aid in, to do whatever we can, but it just, when fighting is going on, it makes it that much more complicated, challenging, and most importantly, dangerous for those delivering the aid and receiving the aid.
And also to give us more perspective in terms of what is happening at this moment at the Gaza Strip, we're being joined by Professor John Blackland, who is an international security expert and a professor in intelligence studies and international security, and is joining us live on the broadcast here. Now, Professor Blackland, it's been 24 hours now since the fighting has resumed. The ceasefire, which had gone on for about 7 days, came to an end. Now, Israel says that its intention is to try wipe out Hamas, but it is doing so by dropping bombs in some of the most densely populated neighborhoods anywhere in the world. It has sparked a humanitarian catastrophe which is being made worse at this moment at the Gaza Strip. Does Israel actually have a strategy in achieving the objective that it claims that it wants to?
Yeah, look, good to be with you. And it is a shocking situation. It's devilishly difficult. Of course, we need to remember that this is largely an information war. While what we're seeing on the screens is about death and destruction, the effect that I think the Hamas has always sought is for this to kind of paint Israel as the ogre, as the bully, as the perpetrator of the violence, trying to make people forget what happened on October the 7th, and to rally the cause. Let's not forget Hamas, prior to October the 7th, was being completely marginalized. Saudi Arabia was on the cusp of doing a deal with Israel. They were almost completely isolated except for support they were getting from Iran and some moral support from Turkey. So this has been a game changer for Hamas. They have been very happy to, well, they've been prepared to see Palestinians sacrificed essentially for the cause, while the Hamas themselves have been hidden away. The hospitals have been used as shields. The resumption of violence is a direct consequence of them not being prepared to give more captives up for exchange for Palestinian detainees in Israel.
Professor Blackland, if I can just interject there, but Israel also has a choice in terms of how it goes after Hamas. You know, what is interesting is that a lot of the top leadership of Hamas is not even present in the Gaza Strip. So if Israel wants to go after Hamas, it should go after Hamas with precision strikes. But what we are witnessing are these 2-ton bombs being dropped in places like Khan Yunis, and they are so densely populated, which is going to make things worse. The death toll is already well over 15,000. There are more than 6,000 children. Many of them do not even know that they are Palestinians who've been killed in this conflict. Is there something different that Israel, that is backed by the United States, can do?
So, look, I'm not sure that those numbers are quite correct. We get those figures from Hamas. Hamas, let's not forget, is a terrorist organization that is bent on actually not telling the truth. So we hear reports of Hamas states, and we hear reports that Israel alleges. It's very interesting the language that's used, to accept what Hamas says at face value.
But we can at least accept what the United Nations is saying. The United Nations says that it is a humanitarian catastrophe that is playing out in the Gaza Strip.
It is a humanitarian.
The United Nations chief has said that Gaza has become a graveyard for children.
Yeah, but what is Israel's options? Let's be realistic here. Israel is facing a terrorist organization that is prepared, and it's continuing to repeat its line that it wants to exterminate the Israelis. Okay, what is it to do? It was in a situation where they were making some rapprochement with the Hamas people from Gaza Strip who were being employed in neighboring areas of Israel. That clearly has completely failed, and no one in the neighborhood is offering any help. So,
but Professor Blackland, this brings back to the question that I started with. If I can just put the question again, the question that I asked was, can Israel resort to these pinpoint accurate strikes rather than resorting to strikes where there is enormous collateral damage? Collateral damage is a term that is used militarily for deaths of innocent civilians who've got nothing to do with this war.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, which is why you've got to ask yourself, why has Hamas allowed them to be there? Why has Hamas sought to control what they're doing and where they're doing it? Why has Hamas not continued its trade of detainees? Now, there's no question that you can challenge Israel for the scale of the bombing and the use of the particular precision weapons, but it's been clear, and a lot of security pundits around the world are acknowledging that Israel faces a challenge where it either has to get rid of Hamas or it faces a repeat of this into the future.
Right.
And nobody is offering to help. Right. The United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Jordan, no one's offering a peacekeeping force to go in to help to hold the Gaza Strip and prevent Hamas from returning to office. So what is Israel to do realistically other than to pursue Hamas? Now, there's no question, you are completely right. The scale of the bombing is terrible. It is absolutely shocking. It's deeply disturbing for everybody. But this is a war. This is a war that Hamas wanted.
This is a war, one would assume, on Hamas and not on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And one expects that Israel would use precision strikes to, in fact, target the Hamas leadership to begin with. That's the least that one expects here. But, Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us with that perspective. We're completely out of time. And this is, of course, a discussion that, that we'll continue to have. But at this moment, what is happening in the Gaza Strip is a humanitarian
situation, but no one's offering seriously to help, mate. This is the problem. Israel is largely on its own here, which is getting some moral support from the United States and substantial support. But it is getting a pushback from many other countries, and none of them, there's faint praise from those who could actually come up with a solution. And that would be akin
Professor,
to what happened.
Professor, we're completely out of time. I think you've had your say. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
International calls for a restraint in fighting are growing since the brief truce ended between Israel and Hamas. Well, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has now said that many civilians have been killed in Israel strikes in Gaza and that the humanitarian law must be protected. Take a listen.
We have been very clear about where we stand on this, which is innocent civilian lives should not be intentionally targeted, and that Israel must do more to protect innocent life in Gaza and innocent civilians in Gaza. And we've been very clear about that, and we continue to make that point, not only privately but publicly.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin also delivered some of his strongest remarks to date over Israeli actions in Gaza. He urged for the need to protect civilians as the intense fighting continues.
You see, in this kind of a fight, the center of gravity is the civilian population. And if you drive them into the arms of the enemy, you replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat. So I have repeatedly made clear to Israel's leaders that protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral responsibility and a strategic imperative.
After these comments by senior U.S. officials, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel has no desire to harm the population and that it is continuing to work in coordination with the U.S. and international organizations to define safe areas for Gaza civilians.
אנחנו קובעים כל הזמן בתיאום עם גורמים בינלאומיים וגם בתיאום עם ידידינו האמריקנים. אנחנו קווים אזורים בטוחים שהאוכלוסייה יודעת שהיא יכולה להתפנות לשם. עשינו את זה בצפון ואנחנו עושים את זה, נעשה את זה גם בזירות אחרות. זה חשוב לעשות כי אין לנו שום רצון לפגוע באוכלוסייה. יש לנו רצון להימנע מפגיעה באוכלוסייה, יש לנו רצון עז מאוד לפגוע בחמאס.
Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. My name is Mohammed Saleh. War has resumed in the Gaza Strip, and what this means is that the possibility of this war spilling beyond the borders of Israel and Gaza is very real. At this moment, a humanitarian catastrophe is sweeping through the Gaza Strip. More than 15,000 Palestinians have been killed, and over 70% of all casualties in the Gaza Strip are those of innocent women and children. But what is giving sleepless nights to a lot of geopolitical experts around the world is the very real possibility that the Houthis in Yemen could potentially shut down the Bab al-Mandeb choke point in the Red Sea to bring pressure on the Americans to rein in the Israeli onslaught. Our next report gets you more details. On the 19th of November, the world woke up to a hijack on the high seas. Armed men in fatigues rappelled down a helicopter and took over the crew of a cargo ship and altered its course towards the port city of Hodeidah. What has since become abundantly clear is that the Red Sea corridor is no longer a safe place of transit for ships owned by Israel or its allies. The 189-metre-long cargo ship called Galaxy Leader was operated by a Japanese crew and was carrying a Bahamas flag. Initially, Israel even tried to distance itself from the ship, but it soon emerged that the ship was linked to the Israeli billionaire Abraham Rami Ungar.
The Yemeni armed forces reiterate their warning to all ships affiliated with the Israeli enemy or those dealing with it that they will become legitimate targets for the armed forces and urge all countries whose nationals operate in the Red Sea to refrain from any work or activity with Israeli ships or ships owned by Israelis.
With the uneasy truce in Gaza having snapped, Israel has resumed its crippling bombardment of the Palestinian enclave. And what this means is that the Red Sea corridor, one of the most important shipping lanes in the world, going out of service for Israel is a very real possibility. The Houthi involvement in the Gaza war won't happen in the Gaza Strip. The strategic location of Yemen on the Bab al-Mandeb choke point means that the biggest escalation of the Gaza war outside the Palestinian territories will happen at the Bab al-Mandeb. The Bab al-Mandeb, which means the Gate of Grief, is a choke point that is just 20 kilometers wide between the Yemeni island of Mayoun to the coast of Djibouti and Eritrea. An estimated 18,000 ships pass through this stretch every single year, which means an average of 50 ships pass through these waters every single day. That is approximately 12% of the global trade must make its way through this narrow checkpoint, which the Houthis can disrupt in case of an escalation. business analysts have already sounded an alarm at the global supply chains getting disrupted. According to Standard & Poor's Commodity Insights, the incident has already exposed Israeli tankers to high insurance rates. In the worst-case scenario, the disruption of this critical trade route can bring the United States and Iran into a direct confrontation. On the 9th of November, the Houthis published a video of shooting down the deadly MQ-9 Reaper drone along the Yemeni coast. The longer Israel's war in the Gaza Strip progresses, the more real becomes the possibilities of the Houthis trying to shut down the Bab el-Mandeb, potentially plunging the world supply chain into a tailspin. The war in Gaza has drowned out the bruising war in Ukraine from the public's imagination. But the fact is, Moscow's invasion of Ukraine is now in its 21st month. The battle lines are frozen. The Western support for Ukraine after the failed spring counter-offensive has created a sense of war fatigue. But there is a quiet realization that even with the best Western weapons, Kiev has been unable to push back the Russian troops. And now with the onset of winter, the Russians, it appears, are gearing up for their own winter offensive. Huliopol is one of the last frontline villages in Zaporizhia that is still under the control of the Ukrainians. Only those people who are too poor and who have nowhere else to go are the only ones who are still living here. Water is scarce, electricity is gone, and keeping oneself warm in the winter is a real struggle.
The missile hit and the walnut tree was smashed to pieces. The window was smashed too. The car was destroyed. I have chopped and dried the bits of wood and can use them now for burjuyka stove.
In Novorovdivka, in the eastern part of Donetsk, 2 people were killed and at least 10 others were injured in a Russian missile strike. Ukrainian positions in Robotyne are being hammered by the Russian artillery, while cruise missiles launched from the Russian frigates in the Black Sea have been used to destroy Ukraine's military and energy infrastructure. What is unfolding at this moment is a build-up to a Russian winter offensive, for which Kiev is increasingly looking ill-prepared and ill-equipped.
The Russian group of forces are carrying out effective and powerful strikes against the Ukrainian army. As a result of this, their capabilities have been drastically decreased. Our servicemen act skillfully and decisively. They are taking better positions and are expanding their control in all directions.
The biggest backer of the Ukrainian war effort, the United States, is making all the right noises, but is not committing the necessary weapons where its mouth is.
Russia sought to destroy Ukraine's critical infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, and to deprive the Ukrainian people of access to heat and electricity at the coldest time of the year. Russia tried to break the will of the Ukrainian people, but of course it failed. As we head into yet another winter, we expect that Russia will return to this cruel tactic and again try to pursue a campaign to destroy Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure.
Publicly, NATO leaders have insisted that there is no other option than to back Ukraine. But reports have emerged in the German media of a potential secret plan for Ukraine, where the American President Joe Biden and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz want to nudge Kiev to negotiate with the Kremlin. Faced with this waning support for its war, the big question is, how much longer can Ukraine hold out against the slowly tightening Russian onslaught? On the 2nd of November, the Russian President Vladimir Putin revoked Russia's ratification of the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is a global treaty banning nuclear weapons tests. The move sent alarm bells ringing. In an attempt to allay the fears, Moscow said that the revocation would not lead to a resumption of nuclear testing again. But it's also added a caveat. The United States, too, must refrain from nuclear testing. For the record, present-day Russia and erstwhile USSR had tested its last nuclear weapon on the 24th of October in 1990, while the United States' last nuclear test had been on the 23rd of September in 1992. In the backdrop of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, the revocation has led to increasingly hostile rhetoric and also the arms control architecture that was built since Soviet Union's collapse more than 3 decades ago has now begun to unravel. How credible is the risk of a full-blown nuclear war, especially when viewed in the light of the deteriorating Russia-US relations? Perhaps it would be wise to listen to the voices of the people affected by these nuclear tests and learn from them.
About 450 nuclear tests were conducted between 1949 and 1989 on the barren steppe near the city of Semey, close to the Kazakh-Russian border. More than 100 of these tests were atmospheric, and the rest, post-1963, were conducted underground. The above-ground explosions, known as atmospheric tests, were in practice until 1963. Authorities used to order local people out of their homes and schools for any such detonations above ground, fearing that ground tremors might cause buildings to collapse.
I must have been a 5-year-old boy. I was very young. We have been told training was supposed to take place. At a certain point of time, leave the house and do not look towards Deligan Mountain. But we were young and curious, so we looked in that direction. First came a yellow flash and a black mushroom after it. The adults tried to drive us away.
The effect of radiation exposure was devastating on the environment and on the health of unsuspecting local people. Kazakh authorities estimate up to 1.5 million people were exposed to residual radioactive fallout from testing. What was their compensation? A certificate confirming their status as victims of tests, which made them eligible for an equivalent of a $40 monthly payout. Over 1 million people received such certifications. Some lost most of their family members to related diseases.
My father died when he was 58. Then my elder brother died, and my sister too. All of them died. We were children and knew nothing. Nobody dared to oppose the government then.
Though there is little reliable data available on the specific health impact of testing in Kazakhstan, scientists believe exposure to radioactive material on the ground, inhalation of radioactive particles in the air, and ingestion of contaminated food, including local livestock, did contribute to increased cancer risk and cases of congenital malformation. The damage wasn't just limited to regions exposed to direct radiation. Steppe winds carried the nuclear fallout across an area the size of Italy. A large portion of such territory is still considered too contaminated to inhabit or cultivate. At a time of rising risk of nuclear war, lending an ear to the sagacious voices would be a wise decision.
We are the people who have witnessed the consequences of the nuclear test site activity. If the countries resume nuclear tests, this is going to repeat itself. The population of the world would be killed. Let our sufferings teach others a lesson. It is necessary to convey our distress to other people. If this resumes, the humankind will disappear.
A 1963 treaty banned the nuclear weapons test in the atmosphere, in space or underwater. But the underground testing, too, poses serious environmental and health risks, besides the potential for contamination of groundwater. Most dangerous of all is the fact that the radioactive contamination lasts for generations. A momentary mistake could potentially impair generations to come. It's time the world paid attention.
In Myanmar, the ruling military junta is facing its biggest challenge since having seized power in a 2021 coup. An alliance of 3 Myanmar ethnic minority groups called the Brotherhood Alliance has waged coordinated offensive since the 27th of October. The offensive named by the rebels as Operation 1027, signifying the date on which it began, has made some inroads into the junta-controlled areas in the northern Shan state, the Kaya state, and also in the Rakhine state in the west. Over 100 military outposts have been overrun. Trade routes to neighboring China have been cut off, and more than 330,000 people have been displaced since the offensive was launched. The Myanmar army so far has failed to mount a serious counteroffensive on the ground and is primarily relying on air and artillery strikes. Almost 200 civilians, including children, have been killed in these clashes. So what's happening in Myanmar at this moment? Our next report gets you the details.
Pokto is a principal town of Sitwe district in the Rakhine state of Myanmar, situated 25 kilometers from the state's capital. Pokto has